Hi, I'm James Verdier, and welcome to the American Institute of Biological Sciences BioScience Talks, which is a forum for integrating the life sciences. On the second Wednesday of each month, we discuss the latest bioscience publications. And as a reminder, if you'd like to read more, point your browser to academic.oup.com/bioscience. For this episode, I was joined by Dr. Daniel Cox, who works at the Environmental Sustainability Institute at the University of Exeter. He joined me to chat about a topic that lies at the intersection of health and the environment, and that's the possible role of nature in shaping human mental health. In his study, he was looking at questions like, do those who spend more time in green spaces have a lower incidence of things like stress, anxiety, and depression? And they had some really fascinating results. So let's get straight to the interview. Dr. Cox, thank you very much for joining me today.
Okay, welcome.
Before we get into the specifics of your article, I was hoping you could give us just a little bit of an idea of your general area of study. It makes intuitive sense that nature provides health benefits, but it turns out that this is actually a quantifiable thing.
Yes, so there's a whole range of studies come out now that have been looking at the role of nature on human health, on our mental health, our physical health, and our social health. And what we're finding is that there's consistent correlations between amount of time spent in nature and measurable health benefits.
Okay, and in this case, we're looking at mental health specifically.
Yes. So what we wanted to do was look at what role specific components of nature play on mental health, or might have on mental health. So what we did was we surveyed mental health in around 300 participants in towns in the UK, and we surveyed the vegetation around their home with remote sensing data, and then we carried out extensive bird surveys in their neighbourhoods.
Okay, and I want to move into the specifics of the elements that you measured, but one thing I was wondering is the mechanism for this known? Is it known how exposure to the natural environment affects humans' mental health?
Yes, of course. So the causal pathways for the way these benefits are delivered are being increasingly well developed, but the mental health benefits, the theory is that nature, looking at nature, provides soft fascinations, which allows you to unwind, allows the mind to unfocus and recover from attention fatigue, which is what we commonly get in modern day life.
That sounds like an explanation of what we intuitively understand about being in nature.
Yes, there's also a couple of more recent studies that are starting to look at kind of brain function and activity, and how that might be affected by interacting with nature. Also, there's studies that's starting to show that within specific conditions, that a stress response is decreased if you have greater amounts of nature around you.
Okay, and so you were seeking to study this, and you mentioned that you looked at several specific components of nature exposure. What was the reasoning behind looking at specific things rather than an overall nature exposure metric? Because
the majority, practically all the studies to date, have looked at nature per se, or time in green space, for example, time in the garden or time in a public park, but almost no one has looked at actually specific components, like specific parts of nature and the role these might play. And the reason we looked at birds and vegetation specifically is that birds are mobile, they're around everywhere, and they're visible forms of nature that people intuitively are connected with and look at.
So is part of the problem from some of the previous studies that the nature people have been viewing may not have been as effective as other kinds of nature?
The studies have generally considered nature to be a more of a binary measure. So you're either in green space or you're not in green space. Whereas certainly in the urban environments, everywhere, it's a lot more complex. You get different levels of vegetation, you get different amounts of biodiversity. We don't know what role that plays. So it's really kind of this study was the first step to try and unpick that.
Okay, so potentially differentiating between a park that's, completely greened over and very naturalistic versus one that's mostly concrete but might be considered a natural seeming environment. You've mentioned them already, but what characteristics did you choose to look at?
So as I said, we used remote sensing data to measure the amount of vegetation in a person's neighbourhood. We took 4 measures of bird populations. So we recorded the abundance and species richness of birds first thing in the morning, which is when they're traditionally recorded by ecologists because they're most active. So it's easier to get a better idea of the number of birds that are there. But we also recorded them in the afternoon, like around lunchtime. Again, the abundance and the richness. Because our conclusion was this is more likely to represent the birds that people see during the day.
No, that's an interesting point. I'm thinking from my own neighborhood at 5:30 in the morning, it's pretty noisy with birdsong, but I'm typically not up and about at 5:30 in the morning, so I tend not to see or hear the birds.
Yes, but it's not just kind of being up first thing in the morning. It's how visible the birds are likely to be as they move around. Because around us, as we walk around, there's a whole range of different as the birds go around their daily lives. But it's the more visible behaviours which people can see, that we think that these afternoon abundance capture that better.
Okay, and just quickly on the remote sensing, I find it interesting. Were you looking at satellite data?
So what we did was we used hyperspectral data to measure the normalized vegetation index, the NDVI, and we measured the amount of pixels, which were a 1.5 meter resolution, that had an NDVI score of 0.2, which is generally estimated to contain vegetation.
Okay, so you have your satellite-based vegetation index data, and you have your bird abundance data, and then you went and compared these to mental health measures. How did that work?
Yes, so what we did was we rolled out an internet survey where we asked people to score the depression, anxiety, and stress scale, which is a established scale for measuring mental health. And so we had a snapshot, so it's cross-sectional snapshot of the mental health of these people, and we also had their address or their postcode, so we knew where they were, or where the so we could then get a measure of the exposure to nature that they have in their daily lives.
Okay, and just a quick note for our U.S. listeners, a UK postal code encompasses a considerably smaller area and number of houses than U.S. postal codes might, which can be very large, particularly in rural areas.
Precisely, yes. So a postcode in the UK is estimated to cover approximately 18 houses.
Okay, so moving along, what did you find? How did these mental health factors correlate with exposure to nature in various ways?
Yes. So what we did was we found a positive correlation between the amount of vegetation around someone's home and afternoon bird abundances and lower levels of poor mental health. So we found that people are less likely to have depression, anxiety, or stress if they had more birds as measured in the afternoon, or more vegetation. And interesting, of the 3 measures, consistently I found this in the different analyses I've done, depression has the most significant association. So it appears to correlate best.
Okay, so you do see that correlation between green space and afternoon bird abundance and mental well-being. And I wondered, in reading the study, did you have to deal with any particular confounding variables? I'm wondering if things like the fact that mentally healthy people may choose to live in greener environments, does stuff like that affect the outcomes?
For sure. So we in the models, we controlled for a large number of socioeconomic variables that may influence or have been shown to influence influence mental health in other studies. So things like gender, income, social deprivation, the population in the neighbourhood, income, education, how connected someone is to nature, which is again, there's another 21 questions self-obsessed survey, and you find that people who are more connected to nature it was a significant predictor of better mental health. We also asked people how much time they spent outside in the previous week compared to normal. Do you spend less time, the same time, or more time? And interestingly, we found that people who spent less time outdoors than usual in the previous week were more likely to feel depressed or anxious.
Okay, and one thing that was also interesting to me was that the curves they're not straight. It's not a 1-to-1 correlation between the amount of green space to which people are exposed and the potential improved mental health states. It seems to vary. Are there threshold effects in this?
Yes. So I haven't talked about this yet, but what we did as a second analysis in the paper is we did a dose response analysis. So we took respondents who lived in neighbourhoods with 10% vegetation, respondents who lived 15%, 20%, 25%, and we did a dose response analysis. So we looked at as a binary response variable, the proportion of respondents who had poor mental health in each one, and then had the binary predictors of socioeconomic variables and and then in each model, a series of models, we increased the amount of vegetation as a binary response, whether it's less than 10%, more than 10%, less than 50%, more than 50%. And with that, you can plot a dose response curve to give you an idea, to show at what level of vegetation there is a significant improvement in mental health. And this has been shown to show some form of causation, some evidence of causation.
Okay, and what were those levels like at which you saw effects? Speaking about the level of vegetation in a percentage is obviously necessitated by the study, but what does that mean in practical terms? What's a 10% vegetated area by that index? What's that look like? Are we talking about people living in small cottages out in the countryside, or is this a city landscape? What are those like?
So this was done in 3 towns, so it's an urban landscape. What we actually found was a measurable decrease in depression and stress at 20% vegetation, and a measurable decrease in anxiety at 30% vegetation. And so that means that, trying to picture the landscape, that means that 20% of the area around your home, within 250 metre radius of your home, has some form of greenery on it that is measurable by the remote sensing data. So leaves or bushes or trees or grass or...
So that doesn't sound like a challenging bar to hit. If one were to try to implement something like this on an existing urban area, it would be more on the order of planting trees and reclaiming, green space that's perhaps unused paved area, and not so much a case of, recommending that everyone move to the countryside.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, these are achievable targets. We managed to put some figures on this as well as a rough estimate, very crude. But in the UK in 2007, it was estimated that £7.5 billion was spent on depression and £8.9 billion was the costs of anxiety. If you manage to save, if all neighbourhoods meet minimum levels of greenery, according to this analysis, you can potentially save £500 million for depression, and I think it was £2.3 billion on anxiety, which is huge amounts of money.
So this sounds like it should be a huge thumb on the scale in favor of increasing urban green space. If you can find a way to convey the usefulness of unlocking that value in terms of mental health savings to those who are doing the planning.
Yes, birds and nature in general provide a really a cost-effective way of treating poor mental health, of improving them, making cities happier, healthier places to live.
And is there any evidence thus far that this is being taken to heart at all by any managers?
There are lots of different, there are different schemes, there are different trials around, but certainly kind of in the UK, you've got problems. There's talk in the media of them cutting funding to green spaces, maintenance of green spaces. Whereas now, certainly with the rise of mental health issues in urban areas, we really need to be investing in our green spaces.
Okay, so it seems like a lot of progress has been made in terms of looking at nature as a medicine, establishing something of a dose-response curve. And I'm wondering now what's next for your research. What are you looking at now?
So now we're looking at a range of different things, but still don't really understand how much nature people experience. So I've got another study that came out that shows that of measurable nature experience, such as time in gardens and times in parks, 75% of the total time spent by our survey population nature was experienced by just 36% of the population. So many people are not getting very much nature exposure at all, and it's understanding how this nature, how much nature people actually experience in their lives, and then linking this to then exploring the health benefits of this.
Okay. So this is a case in which people may live in the area, but for one way or another, perhaps leaving their front door and heading directly to a vehicle, they're not actually being exposed.
Precisely, yes. So like parks, for example, are available to all, but very, very small, a surprisingly small percentage of the population actually use them. Whereas like gardens are more accessible. But again, it's like just trying to understand exactly kind of how much nature people experience.
And it also seems like there are other potential implications too. I'm thinking about heavily planned structures for shopping, where traditionally it's been in at least in the U.S. it's been indoor malls, was for many decades. Which obviously one is exposed to very little nature inside those, but an outdoor facing park with some greenery in the planning, would obviously have rather different effects.
Yes, totally. We're also looking at the distribution of wellbeing benefits, like the relative importance of different areas. I did just see a couple of days ago that China's now, because their cities are really polluted, they're now pushing green buildings. They're planting a lot of trees on buildings to try and help clear up the smog problem.
And we'll obviously look forward to the outcomes of that research as well. Dr. Cox, thank you very much for joining me today.
Okay, thank you very much.
And that concludes this episode of BioScience Talks. Just a reminder, the journal BioScience is published by Oxford University Press on behalf of the American Institute of Biological Sciences and is made possible by the support of our members and donors. Thank you, and talk to you next time.